Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and I'm joined by our special guest, an old friend of Forbidden Planet, Mr. Garth Ennis. How are you doing, Garth?
I'm great, Andrew. Thanks. How about you?
I'm good, thanks. You had the by rote answers, almost as if we'd had exactly the same conversation 30
Mere
seconds ago.
seconds ago, yeah.
Which we did because I forgot to press the record button last time. So it's good to see you again, mate.
You too.
A great mutual love of ours is World War II, and but you have applied your love and interest in military history in a far more constructive way than me, because in my case it's involved just watching hundreds of like war movies and reading hundreds of books. In your case, you turn it into your actual profession. So you've got another one of your great war books coming up. What can you tell me about it, mate?
Okay, so in February, Aftershock are going to start publishing The Lion and the Eagle. And that's a 4-part story in their new oversized format. They probably have a special name for it. 40 pages per issue with art by PJ Holden.
Oh, lovely.
And it is the story of the Chindits, of a massive British Special Forces operation behind the lines in Burma in 1944.
Yeah. Now, I remember years ago you telling me that you were interested in writing a story about this particular pocket in history. So what is it that's always interested you about this?
Partly it's the war in Burma itself, the sheer savagery of the conflict between the British and the Indians and the Gurkhas on the one hand and the Japanese on the other, where you had a level of inhumanity that the war in the West that the British fought with the Germans, for instance, really seldom reached. Here, partly due to the racial aspect, partly due to the behavior of both sides, you really had a particularly savage theater of conflict, no mercy, no holds barred. I think it was one of those classic instances where as soon as one side demonstrates inhumane behavior, the other picks up on it. And pretty soon what you have is a kind of an ongoing bloodbath. So there's that's interesting to me. The other aspect of the story that interests me, I think, is that you have this notion, and it's been attractive to people writing military fiction from the beginning, really, about the special force, about the highly trained unit, the usually small group of individuals who can achieve almost anything with their incredible skills and strengths and so on. Quentin Tarantino memorably used the phrase "guys on a mission."
Yeah.
And we all knew instantly what he meant because we'd all seen those movies, read those comics. What the British did in this instance was really a variation on that theme. Instead of taking a small, highly trained unit and dropping them behind enemy lines and leaving them to create havoc and essentially rely on the small size and requirements of the unit for concealment, they tried something different. They airlifted an absolutely enormous force of thousands of men in 3 or 4 different battalion or regiment-sized groups behind enemy lines, and then left them to get on with it. So all of a sudden, far from being easy to conceal, you have a very large and very obvious force right in the enemy's midst, which in theory will be supplied by air, medevaced when necessary by air, that will be capable of putting a massive thorn in the Japanese side in this instance, and hopefully upset the balance of the war in Burma in the British favor. Things didn't work out that way, of course. It was very much a case of biting off more than you could chew, but it does go back to this almost mystique that the highly trained special force has, that if we train these guys well, there's nothing they won't be able to accomplish. And as has been discovered again and again and again, that's not true. And my story involves the characters really finding that out the hard way.
Yeah, which I'm not surprised to hear that it's a finding out the hard way deal. How did you end up working with your artist on this? How did you get into that?
With PJ, well, he
Yeah.
and I have done a number of war comics together. We did a battlefield story called Happy Valley.
Oh yeah, I remember
He,
that one.
yeah, he took over the World of Tanks book for Dark Horse from Carlos Esquerra. We did a graphic novel called The String Bags, which went
Yeah.
over very well. And really, he was just the obvious choice. He's a great storyteller, particularly good with character, doesn't mind doing his research, and has a nice grasp of I think place and setting and time. He makes it look like the period. And he makes the characters look as if they're of that time, which is quite a useful skill for something like this.
Yeah, right on. And who are your core cast of characters on this book?
Okay, so you have two British officers, um, Colonel Keith Crosby, very young to be a colonel, in charge of a British Chindit unit, and you have his good friend and chief medical officer, Dr. Alistair Whitamore. And these two have a bit of unfinished business with the Japanese. The whole Chindit idea really came about because the British weren't making much headway in Burma. The Japanese had them stymied no matter what they tried. And so the idea of a highly trained special force suddenly seemed very, very attractive. Maybe just bash something loose. And so it is with these two on a more personal level, because they were involved in the retreat through Burma in 1942 when the Japanese swept the British and Indian armies really right across the map, from Malaya, as it then was, through Burma, all the way to the gates of India, as was said. And during that time, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, there was a great deal of atrocity committed by Japanese soldiers, very much a question of the different sort of martial philosophy of their country, of their tradition. And so this left a lot of British soldiers and the British in general with a sense of unfinished business. As I say, they'd been kicked out, so they'd lost, so that's one thing, but they'd also seen Keith and Alistair in particular saw their men captured and horribly abused and tortured and ultimately murdered. This was really, I can't emphasize this enough. This was a Japanese trademark at the time, and it tended to spur similar behavior in their opponents. So these two, Keith and Alistair, join the Chindits, and they go back into Burma as part of this massive special force, intending to set the balance to rights, you might say. To if you were to really reduce it, you would say almost to get revenge, to get their own back. This sense that things have to be set right. There's a third member of the cast, Havildar Major Ranbir Singh, who's a Sikh soldier. He's the equivalent of a sergeant, and he's really Keith's right-hand man. He's a bit older, a bit more experienced, not just as a soldier, but in the ways of the world. And he's smart enough to know that if you go looking for revenge in the middle of a world war, it's unlikely to pan out the way you expected. And so we see what happens with these three against the background of the Chindit operation in Burma in the spring of 1944, when this idea of attacking the Japanese, really bearding them in their lair, getting them behind their lines, goes a bit skew-whiff, because as usual, of course, no one's asked the Japanese what they think. No one's checked in to see if the enemy are going to do what they're supposed to do according to the British plan. And that is one of the flaws in this operation. That is where things do go somewhat awry, and that's why.
Now, you've touched upon something that I find fascinating about your your war work, your combat work, which is being the extremely interested party you are in, like combat history and war history. What I get a sense of in your, what's very different about reading your stuff to say reading the Sergeant Rock comic from the 60s, right? As much as I love those, is that your the prism of your storytelling, it's always bled through that the deep levels of research you've done on your own time. You know that the level of working knowledge you have of these different conflicts brings it a degree of authenticity. The issues you're just talking about, which is the way that the British military forces and military establishment think versus the way the Japanese think. That's something that's not often examined on the comics page, but I think it's what really works in the different theatre of war stories that you do about what you do. And is that research? Is it like, I know you're really into war history, but is it kind of a never-ending process for you? Are you always finding different aspects of the conflict that you're interested in?
Yeah, there's always something. It could be a single incident that you think, I want to write about that. On the other hand, you could find the entire background to a story so fascinating that you want to bring that into play. For instance, in this one, you do have a sense of a number of different conflicts coming to the boil all at once. The British want to get back into Burma because they're worried about the Japanese invading India. The Japanese, of course, pressed in the Pacific by the Americans. They have their own agenda too. China's involved because next door to Burma is China, where the Japanese have been fighting since they invaded in 1931 and doing horrific damage, I should say. Keith has a conversation in the first issue with a young Chinese officer who's attached to the general staff, kind of as an observer, that gives us an insight into how the Chinese see all this. Of course, they are in the middle of their own civil war, which has kind of gone on the back burner during the Japanese invasion, but the Chinese civil war between the communists under Mao and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. And so what I try to do is I try to build up a picture of, as I say, a number of conflicts coming to the boil all at once, and ultimately asking the question, well, that the characters often don't, which is, what are you doing here? What are British people doing in Burma in the first place? And come to that, what are they doing in India? And how does it affect the Chinese? And when it comes to the Japanese, how will they be affected, given that they're now fighting almost a three-front war? So all this is coming together at once. And as I say, Keith and Alistair's, Keith in particular, his notion of revenge, he finds it playing out against a far different backdrop than he expected, largely because as a young British officer, he maybe hasn't thought as hard as he should about what his own country's agenda is and what the agendas of other countries are. That's the kind of thing I find fascinating, the backdrop to all the battle action, and there is plenty of battle action, yeah. I promise you.
I believe you, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's what resonates about your work. It's the parallels of the combat savagery, which we all enjoy watching and reading about, and the way the combat mind works, but with that patina of socio-political, socio-political vantage point we have now, where we just question all of those things that you grow up within the UK, within a certain, when I was reading war comics, same ones that you were in the 70s, there's a lot of things that aren't covered in those books, in terms of
that's right.
Britain's imperialist past and
that's right.
acquisitive viewpoint.
I mean, as an example, there are two armies. The British have two armies fighting in this story. And they've drawn the Chindit unit from both. You have the British Army, simple, and the Indian Army. And in the first episode, the Chinese officer I mentioned asks Keith about the Indian Army, and Keith explains, well, the Indian Army, because the British run India, The Indian army is actually a British army. It's Indian troops with British officers for the most part. And the Chinese officer, who again is a little bit older than Keith, asks, "Oh, and that's an arrangement that suits the Indians, is it?" And Keith, with no idea that anything else could possibly be the case, says, "Oh, yes, absolutely." He's going to find out, of course, that it's not as simple as that. Yeah. And later on, that his conversation with that Chinese officer actually is the first part of a framing sequence, because he meets him again at the very end of the story under, for both of them, unimaginably different circumstances a few years later, when it's time to look back and see not just what happened, but how things transpired in terms of their expectations. A young British officer fighting to regain Burma for the British Empire, a young Chinese officer who thought he was going to help drive the Japanese out of his country in the name of Chiang Kai-shek. If you know your history at all, you'll know that he was in for a nasty surprise as well.
Yeah, I love your use of the framing device, the coda, on some of these, like, war tales, just to give it that sense of context. I think it's a nice sort of lean narrative device that allows you to give that weather eye to the macro picture without undermining the drama of it's an entertaining book, Yeah. But I think the fact that you've been able to do that is really part of the extreme value in the way you're almost this one-man military band who pursues this kind of narrative within the the comics business, because comics have got a rich legacy of war comics, but pretty much it's just you these days.
Yeah, me and a couple of others. I think that's largely true, and it really goes back to the comics I read as a kid.
Yeah.
As opposed to the ones pretty much everyone else did. And that is, as much as anything else, a quirk of the spotty distribution of American comics in my part of the world, as it is anything else. I've said this before, but I feel that in a way, I dodged a bullet there because even if I look at John McCrae, who lived just down the road from me in Belfast, he was able to amass a pretty decent collection of American comics. I wasn't. I saw them very, very rarely. And if it had happened any other way, I would probably be just one more guy with a great idea for Green Lantern.
Yeah, mate, it's so true. It's so true. Now, on that note of great things you can do in the war space, you're going to come back on in the near future and talk about another great project you've got lined up. This time with the Boys at Rebellion, which is a revival of Battle Action, which we won't talk about now because we'll devote a whole episode to it. But mate, I can't wait for that. And I'm for many reasons that you know all about, I'm very excited to see that book. But for here now, I think The Lion and the Eagle is right up my street. I think if you love war comics, you're going to really enjoy it. And by the way, the covers I've seen so far by Tim Bradstreet look amazing.
Yeah, Tim's done a really good job. He's very good with figure work and character, Tim, and he's managed to give us some really nice shots of the Chindits, also of the Gurkhas. There's a Gurkha battalion involved. These are the Nepalese mercenary soldiers who I believe are still part of the British Army to this day. Talk about a legacy of the Imperial past, but they had a reputation as being extremely hard fighters. And I've always really wanted to write about the Gurkhas, actually, because theirs is a martial tradition really like no other. And they were more than happy to meet the Japanese on their own terms as far as savage man-to-man combat goes. But Tim's done a terrific job on that. We also have a lovely variant cover on the first issue by Keith Burns.
Oh, lovely.
Who, being such an expert aviation artist, has given us a tremendous Spitfire cover, because one of the aspects of the story does involve the air cover that the British have arranged for their behind the lines incursion. they think, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, they think that what will prevent the Japanese from crushing them with a superior sized force is air superiority. So if they have enough fighter bombers to attack Japanese artillery and enough fighters to shoot down the Japanese fighters that show up to protect the Japanese artillery, then they'll be able to maintain kind of an air bridge of resupply, of medevac flights. This all depends on them having enough aircraft. So as long as the Japanese don't do anything untoward, they should be absolutely fine. And for a while, you will see British Hurricanes, British RAF Hurricanes bombing and rocketing the Japanese positions. You will see Spitfires protecting them. That's the subject of Keith's cover. But when events elsewhere start to play a role in this, as they so often do in war stories, you'll see that notion start to wear down a bit, and then the British pilots are having to fight just as hard as the guys on the ground. Anyway, Keith's done a tremendous cover too that will hopefully reflect that.
I can't wait. This element of the story is the living embodiment of that old military adage, right? No plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. And everything's linked together. Everything relies on everything else. And when you have one of these plans where so long as everything goes like clockwork, we'll be fine, you're really asking for trouble. Yeah. And so it proves.
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait. And that writ large was the whole Arnhem thing, right? That's it. Well, it needs this, and this, and of course,
that's right.
Once it all goes horribly wrong.
Yeah. Although there is one more aspect to it, and this is something I haven't really looked into in war stories before, and that's the question of casualties, because at least at Arnhem, there was you did have this occasional civility that featured between British and German troops. Truces could be called so that casualties could be removed from the field of battle. I think at Arnhem, the Germans even took British casualties into their field hospital while the battle was ongoing. That isn't a possibility here. Yeah. There is no arrangement with the Japanese. I think as Keith says at one point, if the Japanese ever signed the Geneva or Hague Conventions, I never heard about it. Yeah. And so Alistair, who, as I said, saw his men suffer horribly 2 years earlier on the retreat, Alistair has been given certain assurances about the medical care the men who come into his field hospital will receive, about medevac flights, about medical supplies being dropped. And how that plays out is really one of the focal points of the story, because of course, as I say, you cannot rely on the occasional goodwill of the enemy at all. And how things play out for Alistair, well, they end up having something of an effect on his mental well-being, shall we say?
Yeah, which is completely understandable, and I think that's a great place to close out on, talking about The Lion and the Eagle, which everybody watching this conversation can order from the links attached to the conversation. You see the links for issues 1, 2, and 3 right here at ForbiddenPlanet.com. And like I said, the book looks great. The covers look amazing. I can't wait to dig into it, mate.
Good. I think you'll enjoy this one. Yeah, it's a good deal darker than a lot of the other war stories, but it's a great looking book, and it should keep up your interest all the way to the end.
That's what I like to hear, mate. Great to see you as always, Garth. You take care of yourself, and we'll have you back soon to talk about battle action.
That's smashing, Andrew. Cheers. You take care too.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.